The dust motes danced in the weak sunlight slanting through the grimy window panes of my study. Each one, a tiny universe, oblivious to the larger, crushing one that had already collapsed around me. My wife, Eleanor, gone. The words still felt like pebbles in my mouth, rough and indigestible. 3 years and the silence in this house, on this ancestral land with obligations in the deed, was still a physical presence, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. I traced the rim of my lukewarm mug, the ceramic cool against my fingertips. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient oaks that bordered the property, their branches skeletal fingers against a bruised sky. This land, inherited from a long line of men who'd understood the earth in ways I never could, felt like a forgotten promise. The deed stipulated certain observances, trivialities I'd always thought until Eleanor's passing. Now, even the mundane felt charged with a desperate, clinging significance. My work used to be my refuge, astrophysics. It was a predictable, logical realm, a stark contrast to the chaotic mess of human emotion. But lately, even the stars felt muted. The data streams from the observatory, once a source of endless fascination, now seemed like meaningless blips, the cosmic static of an indifferent universe. I was a man adrift, clinging to intellectual rigor like a drowning sailor to driftwood. My fingers, stained with ink from countless late nights poring over spectral analysis, hovered over the keyboard. The screen glowed, a pale blue rectangle in the dim room. I was running a diagnostic on a new array of deep space sensors, a project I'd initiated before. It was a long shot designed to detect subtle gravitational anomalies, the kind that might betray the presence of unseen matter. Mostly it was a way to keep my mind occupied, to force it into channels that didn't lead back to the empty space beside me in bed. The preliminary results flickered into existence. Nothing, as expected. A faint hum emanated from the server rack in the corner, a comforting, familiar sound. The air in the study was thick with the scent of old paper and dried ink, a scent that was inextricably linked to Eleanor. She'd loved this room, loved watching me work, her presence a warm counterpoint to the sterile glow of the monitors. I could almost feel her beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a phantom warmth. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Perhaps it was time to admit defeat. The grief was a gravitational pull, warping my thoughts, dulling my senses. The stars, the equations, they offered no solace, only a vast, echoing emptiness that mirrored my own. I'd been chasing ghosts in the data, a futile attempt to find order in a universe that had proven itself to be anything but. Then something caught my eye. A single data point flagged by the diagnostic program, an outlier, not a glitch, the system insisted, a genuine anomaly. My brow furrowed. This was unusual. The sensors were calibrated to an unprecedented degree of precision, for something to register as a significant deviation. It had to be something truly extraordinary. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the raw data. It was a faint signal, buried deep within the noise, originating from a region of space previously thought to be unremarkable. A cluster of ancient stars, far beyond the reach of our nearest galactic neighbors. The anomaly wasn't a gravitational ripple, as I'd initially hypothesized. It was different, a pattern. I zoomed in, isolating the signal. It was complex, layered, not the random fluctuations of cosmic background radiation, nor the predictable signature of a known celestial event. This was structured, deliberate, a ripple not of gravity but of something else, something that felt intentional. My breath hitched. I ran the analysis again, cross-referencing with every known celestial phenomenon. Nothing matched. The pattern was unlike anything cataloged. It was elegant, intricate, and profoundly alien. I felt a strange, almost primal tremor deep within my gut, the sheer improbability of it. The universe I'd always believed was governed by laws, by predictable forces. This signal, however, suggested something else. A mind, a consciousness, vast, ancient, and utterly incomprehensible. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes with a sudden violence. The trees groaned, their branches scraping against the glass. I ignored it, my eyes glued to the screen. And for the first time in years, a flicker of something other than grief ignited within me. A terrifying, exhilarating curiosity. Was I seeing things? Was this just another hallucination brought on by stress and sleepless nights? Or had I truly stumbled upon something that would change everything? The inherited desk groaned under the weight of my research. Stacks of star charts, spectral analyses, and printouts of raw telemetry formed precarious towers. The air in this room, in this old house on the ancestral land with obligations in the deed, always carried a faint scent of dried ink and dust, a comforting perfume of intellectual pursuit, or it used to. Now it felt stagnant, heavy with my grief. Eleanor had loved this old place, its quietude, its history. She'd said it was a place where thoughts could breathe. My thoughts lately felt suffocated. I was sifting through data from the Kepler telescope, a routine deep-field survey. When it had first appeared, a flicker, a ghost in the machine, a brief, inexplicable dip in stellar luminosity from a star that should have been stable, unremarkable. I dismissed it. A sensor glitch, a cosmic ray, 1,000 mundane explanations. My mind, still reeling from Eleanor's absence, clung to the mundane like a drowning man to driftwood. But it had returned. Not a flicker this time, but a sustained, rhythmic dimming. I'd spent weeks rerunning diagnostics, cross-referencing with other observatories, poring over the raw feeds from Kepler, Hubble, Chandra. Nothing. No terrestrial interference, no solar flares, no stellar activity that could account for it. The data was clean, stark, and utterly baffling. The star was designated KIC 8,462,852, a G-type main sequence star, much like our own sun. Its light curve, the graph of its brightness over time, was usually a placid, undulating line. But for the past 3 nights, interspersed with periods of normalcy, it had been exhibiting these peculiar, sharp drops. Each drop was distinct, almost deliberate. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath misting the cool glass. The latest data stream was scrolling in, line by agonizing line. My fingers, usually nimble on the keyboard, felt clumsy. The room was silent except for the hum of the ancient server rack and the occasional creak of the house settling. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient oaks that dotted the ancestral land with obligations in the deed. A sound that once soothed me now felt like a mournful sigh. Then it happened again. The steady line of the light curve wavered. A sharp, almost geometric descent began. It wasn't the gradual fade of a star being eclipsed by a planet. This was different. Faster, sharper, as if something were passing in front of the star, something that didn't behave like any celestial body I knew. The dip continued, reaching an unprecedented depth. My heart, a sluggish organ these past months, began to thrum a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. My palms grew slick. I zoomed in on the spectral data corresponding to the dimming period. The usual stellar signature was there, but overlaid, almost masked by something else. A faint, alien pattern. It wasn't noise. It wasn't an artifact. It was structured, organized. Like a whisper in a language I didn't understand but could somehow sense the intent behind. The implications began to press in, not with the crushing weight of grief, but with a cold, sharp dread. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was something else. I pulled up the orbital mechanics simulations. I ran models for asteroid belts, rogue planets, even hypothetical Dyson spheres. None of them fit the observed pattern. The dimming was too frequent, too precise. The spectral overlay was too structured. It was as if the star itself was being momentarily obscured by an impossibly vast, impossibly intricate object. An object that appeared and disappeared with an unnerving regularity. The dimming stopped. The light curve began to climb back towards its baseline, the spectral signature fading. I shivered, pulling my worn cardigan tighter. The data was undeniable. The anomaly was real. But what was it? I stared at the graph, the sharp, unnatural dips like jagged teeth in an otherwise smooth line. My mind, the one that had always sought order and explanation in the cosmos, was grappling with something that defied all known physics. The sheer scale of the implied object was staggering. It would have to be enormous, impossibly vast, to cause such a profound dimming. And the structured spectral data, it suggested intelligence. If something that immense could hide itself, what else could it do? What was its purpose? Was it merely passing by, an accidental shadow cast across the celestial stage, or was it watching? I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs on the wooden floor jarring in the stillness. My gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the desk. Eleanor, smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I remembered her telling me once, when I was lost in the labyrinth of equations, that sometimes the greatest discoveries lay not in finding answers, but in learning to live with the questions. But this question felt different. The dimming had stopped, but the unease remained, a persistent, icy prickle on my skin. This wasn't just data anymore. It was a sign, a communication, or a warning. And if it was a warning, about what? The air in this room, in this old house on the ancestral land with obligations in the deed, always carried a faint scent of dried ink and dust. It was the smell of my father's work, and now it was the smell of my own obsession. I'd been staring at the same set of data for 3 days straight. The faint, almost imperceptible oscillations in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Not random noise, not instrumental error, something else. Something that whispered of order where there should be chaos, of intent where there should be chance. I traced the faint lines on the printout with a fingertip. Each anomaly, a tiny ripple, but when I overlaid them, when I mapped their distribution across the sky, a pattern began to emerge. It was too structured, too deliberate. My wife, Eleanor, used to say I saw ghosts in the machine. She'd laugh, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and pull me away from the glowing monitors, towards the setting sun. Now, only the hum of the old servers answered me. The hum was a constant, a low thrumming beneath the silence of the house, a reminder that I was alone with these impossible figures. I ran the cross-correlation again. The spectral signatures weren't matching any known celestial phenomena. These were different. They possessed a complex harmonic structure, like a vast, impossibly intricate chord being struck across the universe. A chord that shouldn't exist. My hands trembled as I adjusted the filters. I was pushing the limits of the processing power, coaxing information from data that was supposed to be too faint, too degraded. The old computers, relics from my father's time, whined in protest. The cooling fans spun faster, their mechanical breath filling the quiet room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the panes of the tall, arched windows. The ancestral land with its obligations in the deed was always exposed to the elements. Then I saw it. Not a single anomaly, but a convergence. A point in space-time, vast and ancient, from which these oscillations seemed to emanate. It wasn't a star, not a galaxy, not anything cataloged in the known universe. Something. I magnified the area. The data resolved into a terrifying clarity. It was a signature, not a natural one. It was too ordered, too mathematically precise. It was like finding a perfect equation etched into the surface of a meteor. My breath hitched. I leaned closer to the screen, my nose almost touching the cool glass. The sheer scale of it was staggering. If this was an origin point, it was ancient beyond comprehension, older than the stars, older than the universe as we understood it, and it was broadcasting these complex, structured signals. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged. The scent of dust and ink seemed to recede, replaced by a faint, metallic tang like ozone after a lightning strike. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, its deep resonance echoing through the house. Each tick felt like a hammer blow against my nerves. I was chasing ghosts, Eleanor had said. But what if the ghosts were real? What if the universe wasn't as empty, as random as we believed? What if there were entities, ancient and vast, that shaped the very fabric of existence? And what if, by delving into this data, I had just announced my presence? The hairs on my arm stood on end. It was a feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by something far more pervasive, something that permeated the very space around me. I quickly minimized the display, the complex patterns vanishing, replaced by the mundane desktop background, but the feeling lingered. The metallic tang in the air intensified. I could hear a faint, almost inaudible hum distinct from the server noise. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to originate from within the walls of the house, from the very earth beneath my feet. It was a sound that felt impossibly old, impossibly alien. My gaze drifted to the window. The ancestral land, usually a familiar, comforting expanse of rolling hills and ancient trees, now seemed different. I was no longer just observing data. I was being observed. What was this entity, and why was it broadcasting these signals? A scent that now mingled with the metallic tang of my own sweat. My fingers, stained with graphite and printer residue, traced lines on a holographic projection of a distant nebula. It was here, in the quiet hum of my makeshift observatory, that the universe had begun to whisper its terrible secrets. The anomaly. It wasn't just a flicker, a glitch in the cosmic background radiation. It was a pattern, a deliberate, intricate weave of energy that defied every known law of physics. For weeks I'd chased it, my sleep a shallow, restless thing, my meals forgotten. The data streams, once a sterile river of numbers, now felt alive, teeming with an intelligence that was both profoundly alien and chillingly familiar. It was the familiar aspect that truly gnawed at me. Like a half-forgotten dream or a face glimpsed in a crowd, it tugged at the edges of my consciousness. My wife, Eleanor, I hadn't allowed myself to think of her for days. Not really. The grief was a physical weight, a constant ache in my chest that I'd learned to ignore. But now, as I stared at the cascading lines of code, her presence seemed to seep from the very wood of the desk, from the worn leather of my armchair. She'd always encouraged my flights of fancy, my wild theories. She'd been the anchor to my often adrift mind. Now, I was adrift in an ocean far vaster than I had ever imagined. I'd been cross-referencing the Anomalies' signature with archival data from older, less sophisticated probes. The kind that had been launched decades ago, before the digital deluge, before the raw computational power that allowed me to sift through the universe's noise. It was a tedious process, like sifting through sand for a single, iridescent grain. But I felt a pull, an instinct that screamed this was the way. The faint scent of ozone from the overloaded equipment filled my nostrils. Then I found it. Not in the raw data, but in the processed logs, buried deep within a decades-old survey of the Andromeda Galaxy. A set of faint, recurring energy spikes. They were minuscule, barely above the background noise, easily dismissed as instrument error or stellar interference, but the frequency, the periodicity, it was a match. A near-perfect match to the anomaly I was currently tracking. My breath hitched. It was like finding a fossil, not of bone, but of light. Evidence. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence that this thing had been here before. Not just observing, but interacting, leaving its mark. This wasn't a new phenomenon, it was ancient. It had touched other stars, other worlds, long before humanity had even learned to harness fire. I zoomed in on the archived data. The energy spikes weren't random. They formed a complex, non-repeating sequence. A language, a signature. I ran it through every decryption algorithm I knew, every linguistic analysis program. Nothing. It was like trying to decipher the rustling of leaves or the ebb and flow of the tide. Yet there was a deliberate structure to it. A sophistication that spoke of an intelligence far beyond my comprehension. The room began to feel smaller. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching me not from the room, but from the vast, indifferent expanse beyond my windows. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was no mere astronomical curiosity. This was a cosmic footprint, a sign that whatever this entity was, it was not confined to a single epoch or a single galaxy. It was a traveler, a force, and it had been here in our galactic neighborhood eons ago. I pulled up the trajectory data for the old probe. It had passed through a specific region of space, a sparsely populated sector of Andromeda. The energy spikes had been recorded during its transit. The entity existed, or at least manifested, in the interstitial spaces between stars. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the aging server rack in the corner. It grew steadily louder, an intrusive sound that scraped at my nerves. The lights in the room flickered. The holographic projector, displaying the swirling nebula, wavered, the colors bleeding into one another. My hands trembled. I felt a sudden, intense pressure behind my eyes, as if something were trying to push its way into my mind. The data from Andromeda wasn't just a record of past interaction. It was a warning, a testament to its enduring presence. And if it had been here before, what was to stop it from returning? What had it done to the civilizations that might have detected it then? My gaze drifted to the window, to the impossibly distant stars scattered across the inky black. They seemed to wink with a malevolent awareness now. The whine from the server intensified, reaching an almost unbearable pitch. The holographic nebula dissolved into a chaotic mess of static. My vision blurred. The scent of ozone was now overpowering, acrid and sharp. I stumbled back from the desk, my chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The house seemed to hold its breath. The energy signature. It was still active. Not just in the past, but now, pulsing, reaching out. And my obsessive digging, my relentless pursuit of this cosmic ghost had it drawn its attention? Had I, Thomas, a solitary man in a dusty room on ancestral land with obligations in the deed, finally stepped into its gaze? It was a smell that had once been comforting, a link to generations of quiet contemplation. Now it felt suffocating, thick with the unspoken dread that had begun to permeate my life. My fingers traced the jagged lines of a spectral graph. It was the signature, the impossible fingerprint that I'd found buried deep within the archives of the observatory. A blip, insignificant to most, but to me a scream in the cosmic silence. This wasn't natural. No known stellar process, no predictable decay could produce such a stark, defined deviation. It was too deliberate, too patterned. I'd spent weeks cross-referencing, calibrating, double-checking. Every simulation, every known astronomical phenomenon had been run through the gauntlet of my skepticism. Each time, the anomaly held its ground, a defiant shard of impossibility reflecting a light that shouldn't exist. It was like finding a perfectly formed geometric shape in the heart of a nebula. My wife, Eleanor, would have loved this. He had a way of seeing the beauty in the chaotic, the order in the seemingly random. She'd always urged me to look beyond the equations, to feel the pulse of the universe. I missed that pulse. I missed her. The data I was poring over now was even more disturbing. It came from a different source, a network of deep space sensors I'd been granted access to through an old colleague's favor, and they had picked up the same signature. Not a fleeting echo, but a sustained hum, a low thrumming that seemed to resonate from a specific point in the sky. I zoomed in on the coordinates. A region of space that had always been unremarkable. A vast expanse of nothing, punctuated by distant, ancient galaxies. But the sensors, bless their tireless circuits, had found something. A subtle distortion. A warping of space-time that was not accounted for by any known celestial body. It was like a ripple on a perfectly still pond, but the pond was reality itself. My hands began to tremble. This was more than just an anomaly. It was a presence. Something vast and ancient lurking in the interstitial spaces, its influence stretching across unimaginable distances. I pulled up another set of data. This was newer, more recent. It detailed subtle shifts in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Tiny, almost imperceptible variations, occurring in a pattern that mirrored the signature of the anomaly. It was as if something was painting on the canvas of the universe, and the paint was reality itself. My breath hitched. I remembered a conversation with Eleanor years ago about the nature of consciousness. She'd mused about whether the universe itself might possess a form of awareness, a grand, slow-moving mind that perceived time and space in ways we couldn't fathom. I dismissed it then as poetic fancy. Now, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The entity. That's what I'd started calling it in the privacy of my own thoughts. This unseen force that was leaving its mark on the very structure of existence. Was it merely an observer, a cosmic artist creating abstract masterpieces, or was there something more, predatory? I ran a temporal analysis on the new data. The shifts in the cosmic background radiation were not random. They were increasing in frequency, becoming more pronounced, and they were converging. All of them, all the subtle ripples and distortions, were pointing towards a single terrifying conclusion. A specific date flashed on my screen, a date that was rapidly approaching. It was linked to a celestial event, a rare alignment of distant quasars that had been predicted for centuries. A cosmic confluence that would, for a brief period, open a window, a point of maximum permeability in the fabric of spacetime. My heart hammered against my ribs. The entity wasn't just observing, was preparing. It was using this impending alignment, this cosmic doorway for something that would occur here on Earth. The anomaly wasn't just a signature, it was a harbinger. I looked out the window at the familiar, comforting landscape of my ancestral land. The ancient oaks stood sentinel, their branches bare against the bruised twilight sky. They had witnessed generations of my family, their quiet lives unfolding beneath their boughs. Now, I felt a profound unease, a sense of profound trespass. My lineage, my presence here, felt insignificant, a fleeting spark against the backdrop of something so immeasurably old and powerful. The sheer scale of it all was beginning to crush me. The knowledge that our reality was not a stable, immutable thing, but a fragile tapestry being subtly rewoven by an unknown hand. And that hand, that vast, indifferent intelligence, was about to make its move. Why us? Why Earth? Was it a curiosity, a target, or something far worse, something I couldn't even begin to comprehend? It was a familiar comfort, or it had been before the numbers began to whisper of things that had no right to be. Now the scent felt cloying like a shroud. I needed to tell someone. The thought had been a persistent hum beneath the frantic activity of my days and nights. Not just a colleague, not just a peer, someone with influence, someone who might listen. The local administrator, a woman I'd only ever seen at town hall meetings, seemed the most sensible choice. He was grounded, practical, the kind of person who dealt with zoning laws and water rights, not the fabric of space-time. I printed the most damning graphs, the ones that showed the impossible deviations, the impossible symmetries that screamed of deliberate design. I highlighted the gravitational anomalies, the redshift patterns that defied all known cosmological models. I even included the audio signatures, the strange, harmonic pulses that seemed to weave themselves into the very background radiation of the cosmos. I laid them out on the desk, a testament to the madness I was uncovering. It felt like preparing a case, a plea for sanity in a universe that was rapidly losing its own. The drive to the administrator's office was a blur of anxious energy. The familiar dirt road that wound through the ancestral land with obligations in the deed felt alien, each rut and dip a potential harbinger of disaster. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers pointing accusingly. I gripped the steering wheel, my grip tight. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the crunch of tires on gravel. I replayed my arguments in my head, trying to find the words that would cut through the inevitable disbelief. The administrator's office was a small, utilitarian building, a stark contrast to the sprawling, weathered charm of the house. Inside, the air was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee. She sat behind a sturdy wooden desk, her expression neutral as I entered. Her name was irrelevant, her role was all that mattered. "Thomas," he said, his voice polite but distant. "What can I do for I?" I laid the papers on her desk, spreading them out carefully. I tried to keep my voice steady to project an air of scientific calm, but the tremor in my hands betrayed me. "I've found something," I began, my voice cracking slightly. "Something profound." I pointed to the graphs. "These are readings from deep space, anomalies, patterns that shouldn't exist, they suggest. an intelligence, something vast, ancient, and aware. She picked up a printout, her brow furrowed, but not in comprehension. It was the kind of furrow one gets when faced with a particularly stubborn smudge on a window pane. She traced a line with her finger, her expression unchanging. "Thomas, these look like fluctuations, random noise, cosmic background radiation is notoriously complex." "No," I insisted, leaning forward. "It's not noise, look at the periodicity, the intricate structure, it's deliberate. And it's not just observational, the gravitational lensing. It's being manipulated on a cosmic scale." She set the paper down gently as if it might bite. Her gaze, when it met mine, was not unkind, but it was utterly devoid of understanding. It was the look one gives to a child who has wandered too far from the playground. "I know I've been through a great deal, losing my wife. It's a terrible burden, but I'm an astrophysicist. I deal with stars and galaxies. This sounds like something else entirely." My breath hitched. "This is something else entirely. That's the point. It's not a metaphor for grief, it's real and it's coming." She stood up, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "I understand I read trying to make sense of things, Thomas. It's natural, but I deal with tangible problems, property disputes, infrastructure. I can't act on. If I read feeling overwhelmed, perhaps I should consider speaking with someone. Professionally." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I was not a scientist anymore. My evidence, my carefully constructed case, was reduced to the ramblings of a broken man. I gathered my papers, my hands shaking now with a different kind of tremor, one born of desperation and a profound sense of isolation. The sterile office suddenly felt like a cage. I had tried, I had reached out, and I had been dismissed. Walking back to my car, the sun felt too bright, too cheerful. The ancestral land with obligations in the deed, usually a place of solace, now felt like a vast, indifferent stage. The trees seemed to mock me with their silent endurance. The wind rustled their leaves, a sound like dry, brittle laughter. The administrator's words echoed in my mind. "Consider speaking with someone professionally." They hadn't heard me, they hadn't understood, and if they couldn't, who else would? I was alone with this terrible knowledge. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than any star. But it was more than just knowledge now. It was a certainty. As I drove away, I glanced back at the small building, the administrator's car parked neatly outside. He was back to her tangible problems, her zoning laws and water rights. He would never know. It knew I was here. It knew I had seen. But what form would that proof take, and who would be left to witness it? The air in the observatory felt heavy, a damp blanket pressing against my skin. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful lament that seemed to echo the emptiness in my chest. I traced the lines on the printout, the same anomalous data that had consumed my nights, that had driven me to the edge of reason. It was real. It had to be. The faint, almost imperceptible tremor beneath my feet confirmed it. Not an earthquake, not the settling of old foundations. This was different. A resonance. I stood on my family's ancestral land with obligations in the deed. A place I hadn't set foot on in years. A place I'd inherited along with a tangled web of duties I'd long since ignored. The observatory, a relic of my grandfather's own scientific curiosity, was here, perched on the highest point of the land, overlooking the desolate plains. He'd always spoken of the stars with a reverence that bordered on fear. I dismissed it then, as youthful fancy. Now, as the ground vibrated with an alien rhythm, I understood. My fingers, stiff and cold, moved across the console. The instruments, usually so precise, were erratic, their readings fluctuating wildly. The cosmic microwave background radiation map, my life's work, was no longer a placid canvas of faint variations. It was rippling, distorting, as if a colossal hand were smearing the ancient light. The patterns were intentional, not random noise. A language, a deliberate, horrifying message being broadcast across the gulfs of space. A low hum began, originating not from the machinery but from the very earth beneath me. It was a sound that bypassed my ears, resonating directly in my bones, a deep, guttural thrumming that promised dissolution. I looked out the reinforced window, my breath catching. The stars, usually sharp pinpricks of light against the velvet black, were blurring. They seemed to stretch, to warp, as if seen through rippling water. The familiar constellations were contorting into impossible geometries, their arrangement a mockery of celestial order. My heart, a sluggish organ moments before, began to beat a frantic tattoo against my ribs. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was a primal recognition, a sense of something ancient and vast awakening, and in its awakening, unmaking. The data I'd found wasn't just information. It was a preamble, a whisper from the abyss that was now a roar. I remembered my wife, her laugh, the warmth of her hand in mine. He had been my anchor, my sanity. This cosmic intrusion, this unraveling of reality, was a mirror to my own shattered existence. The hum intensified, the tremors growing more violent. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the observatory into a Stygian gloom, broken only by the eerie, distorted starlight seeping through the warped windows. I had to do something. This wasn't just about understanding. It was about survival, not just my survival, but the survival of everything. The deed, the obligations. My grandfather's strange warnings. He'd spoken of a balance, of a responsibility to this land, to something within it. I dismissed them as folklore, the ramblings of an old man steeped in the solitude of this place. But now, as the very fabric of existence seemed to fray, those ramblings felt like scripture. The data pointed to a nexus, a point of convergence where this cosmic influence was most potent. It was here, on this ancestral land with obligations in the deed. The instruments, even in their chaotic state, were still registering something, a faint, pulsing energy signature emanating from beneath the observatory, a source. My grandfather's study. It was in the old stone building at the edge of the property, a place I'd always avoided. He'd kept his personal notes there, locked away. I'd never bothered to look. Now I knew I had to. The deed mentioned a specific obligation tied to the preservation of a certain artifact. I'd never known what it was. The flashlight beam danced across the warped floorboards, illuminating cracks that seemed to deepen and spread with each tremor. I could feel it now, a pressure building, a sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by an immense, indifferent awareness that had suddenly noticed a speck of dust on its vast, unknowable surface. I had to reach that study. I had to find whatever my grandfather had hidden. The stars outside were no longer stars. They were something else. Eyes, watching, waiting. What ancient power had my family been tasked with guarding, and what was it about to unleash? The silence that followed was not a relief. It was a vacuum, a gaping maw where the cacophony of the universe had been. My hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the abrupt cessation of all sensation. The printouts lay scattered, meaningless ink on paper. The patterns I'd spent years deciphering now a cruel mockery. I looked around the observatory, the familiar metallic tang of old machinery and the faint scent of ozone usually a comfort. Now it was alien. The very air seemed thinner, the light from the monitor harsher, as if the world had been scrubbed clean of its nuance. My wife's photograph, propped against a console, seemed different. Her smile, once a beacon, was now flat, as if the artist had captured a likeness but not the warmth, the spark that had defined her. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the frame. It felt like touching glass, but not glass I recognized. The texture was subtly wrong, too uniform, too perfect. I pulled my hand back, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The wind outside had died down. The howling was gone. It was replaced by a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the earth but from within my own skull. It vibrated through my teeth, a constant, unnerving thrum. I closed my eyes, trying to recapture the feeling of the data, the exquisite terror of knowing. I stood, my legs stiff. The floor beneath my worn boots felt softer, as if the concrete had been replaced by a resilient, yielding substance. I took a step, then another. It was like walking on a meticulously crafted stage, every element precisely placed, every sound engineered. I had to leave. The observatory, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I fumbled with the heavy steel door, my fingers clumsy. The latch, usually stiff and protesting, slid open with unnerving ease. A faint click, then it was free. The outside air was cool, but it carried a strange, sterile scent, like purified water or a freshly sterilized surgical instrument. No hint of pine, no damp earth, no distant city smog, just nothing. The landscape stretched before me, familiar yet fundamentally altered. The jagged peaks of the distant mountains were smoother, their contours softened, as if sculpted by an unseen hand. The trees, once a riot of greens and browns, now stood in uniform shades, their branches reaching skyward in unnervingly symmetrical patterns. It was beautiful in a sterile, lifeless way. Like a photograph painstakingly retouched, my gaze fell upon the fence that marked the boundary of my family's ancestral land with obligations in the deed. The weathered wood, the rusted barbed wire, they were still there, but the imperfections, the cracks, the peeling paint were gone. The fence stood perfect, unnervingly so. The deed itself, a document passed down through generations, a testament to promises made and kept, felt like a distant memory. I could almost hear the rustling of its parchment, the scratch of the old ink, but the feeling of it, the weight of history, was absent. I walked towards the edge of the woods, the hum in my head intensifying. The leaves on the ground crunched, but the sound was too clean, too uniform. No variety in the snap, no varied textures. I stopped, staring at a patch of moss on a tree trunk. It was a perfect green, a shade I'd never seen in nature, too vibrant, too saturated. It looked painted on. A flicker of movement caught my eye. A bird, perched on a branch. It was a robin, its breast the familiar russet, but its song. It was a single, pure note, repeated with flawless precision. No trills, no variations, no natural hesitations. It was like a synthesized melody. This wasn't just a change in perception. This was a change in reality itself. The data hadn't just shown me the entity. It had invited it. And now it was here, reshaping everything, erasing the beautiful, messy imperfection of existence. I thought of my wife's smile, of the way her laughter used to fill a room, a chaotic, joyous sound. I thought of the rough bark of the trees, the unpredictable flight of a real bird, the scent of rain on dry earth, all of it replaced by this pristine emptiness. My breath hitched. The hum in my head grew louder, more insistent. It felt like a question, an answer, and a demand all at once. I looked at my hands, the lines on my palms, the calluses from years of work. They looked smoother. The texture was subtly different, less defined. Was this what it meant to be observed, to be refined? I turned back towards the observatory, a desperate urge to reverse whatever I had done. But the door was closed, and the smooth, perfect wood offered no handle, no latch, no sign of entry. It was just a seamless surface. The hum pulsed, and I felt a disquieting sense of being seen, not by eyes, but by an all-encompassing awareness. Was this the price of knowledge? To have the universe scrubbed clean of its soul, leaving only a flawless, soulless shell. And if my wife's image was already altered, what else had been corrected? The silence. It was the loudest thing I'd ever experienced. Not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy blanket smothering the very air I breathed. My fingertips, still tingling with phantom echoes of the cosmic hum, traced the edge of a data sheet. The numbers swam, meaningless now. Patterns, the elegant, terrifying patterns, had vanished, erased, as if the universe itself had blinked and corrected its own mistake. My breath hitched. I looked around the dusty archive room, the familiar scent of decaying paper and stale air suddenly alien. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed, a mundane sound that felt like a blasphemy. Outside, the wind rattled the ancient window panes of the manor, a sound I'd always associated with the quiet solitude of my research. Now, it sounded like a ragged, desperate whisper. My wife. Her photograph sat on the cluttered desk, her smile a cruel taunt. And now even that had been taken away, or had it. I stood, my legs stiff, my body protesting the sudden stillness. The truth, once so stark and terrifying, had become fluid, elusive. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The entity, the vast intelligence, had shown me something, had allowed me to glimpse its workings, only to snatch it back. Why? This was not an end. It was a change. A subtle, insidious shift. The world outside the archive room, the world I had fought to understand and protect, was no longer the same world I had left. I walked to the window, pushing aside moth-eaten velvet curtains. The grounds of the ancestral land with obligations in the deed spread out before me, bathed in the wan light of a bruised twilight. They had stood for centuries, silent witnesses to generations of my family, each bound by those same peculiar obligations. Obligations I had never truly understood until now. My grandfather's words, almost forgotten, echoed in my mind. The land remembers, Thomas. It holds the echoes of what was and what is to come. Some debts are not paid in coin, but in awareness. Awareness. He had always spoken in riddles. Now I felt the weight of his meaning pressing down on me, as heavy as the sky. The data had been a revelation, a brief, blinding flash of understanding. The entity was not just an observer. It was a gardener, a sculptor, a weaver of realities. It pruned the branches of existence, shaped the very fabric of the cosmos according to some unfathomable design. And Earth, with its burgeoning consciousness, its cacophony of thought and emotion, had become a particularly interesting specimen. This land, my inheritance, was more than just soil and trees. It was a node, a focal point, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The obligations in the deed weren't about maintaining hedges or repainting the manor. They were about guardianship, about holding the line. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just a vast, expectant hush. It was the sound of a universe holding its breath. I remembered the final printout, the one that had flickered and died before my eyes. Not destruction, not annihilation, but refinement. A gentle, terrifying correction. Earth was being subtly reshaped, its inhabitants' perceptions subtly nudged, their thoughts guided. We were being made to fit, to conform to the grand design. My own thoughts felt calmer now. The frantic urgency, the burning need to warn humanity had receded. A strange placidity had settled over me, a quiet acceptance. It was easier this way, to understand, to yield, to become a part of the grand tapestry. The entity had shown me its power, its ultimate control, and in that revelation it had also offered a form of peace. The peace of surrender. My eyes seemed deeper, older. A faint smile touched my lips, a mirror of my wife's on the photograph. It wasn't the smile of understanding, but the smile of one who knows. And the knowing was not a burden, but a release. The wind outside picked up, a low moan that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the manor. It carried with it a scent, faint but distinct, of ozone and something else. I felt a subtle shift within myself, a realignment. My own internal constants were being adjusted. My purpose, once so clear, was now different. I walked back to the desk, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a measured, deliberate grace. The scattered papers no longer seemed meaningless. They were fragments, echoes of a truth that was no longer relevant. The real truth was now woven into the fabric of my being, into the very air I breathed. The entity was not coming. It was already here. It had always been here. And my role, our role, was not to fight it, but to become its instrument, to ensure the continued smooth operation of its grand, cosmic garden. And I, Thomas, son of this land, was ready to play my part in the new order. But as I reached out to gather the discarded printouts, a single, stray word from the final, vanished sequence flickered in my mind's eye. A word I hadn't understood before, a word that now sent a tiny tremor through the newfound calm. Assimilation. What exactly was being assimilated, and into what?